If you're someone who has really enjoyed taking photos with your phone, maybe even with a smaller camera, and you're curious about what it might be like or what would be the steps for you to do more with your photography, to step up to a more professional level camera or a higher end prosumer camera where you can take your hobby further or maybe even start a photography business, I have this video for you, which is going to give you some information on how to learn photography. So, my name is Kimberly Beer. I am a professional photographer. I've been a photographer for over 40 years and a professional one for the last 35 or so. I am a certified professional photographer from the Professional Photographers Association of America. And my primary subject is horses. So chances are, if you're watching this video, you probably found me through horses. And here's an opportunity to learn about photographing them. If you don't have horses or don't intend to photograph horses, hey, you can hang out because all of the information is basically the same with just a few little tidbits I'm going to put in on specifically photographing horses. So let's dive in. So photography is the most challenging, simple thing you will ever learn how to do. So at its heart, it is pointing a device at a scene and pressing a button. So that's as simple as it can be. As complex as it can be is learning how to manipulate things within the camera and how you're taking the photo and the feeling and being able to capture the moment to translate that feeling to yourself in the future when you view the photo or to someone else who is viewing the photo for the first time. And there is a ton of control that you can exercise through your skill level, through your artistic eye. They always talk about the photographer's eye, and also through your equipment, from what equipment you choose to the settings that you choose to be able to manipulate how that particular image is captured and thus how it looks when the final viewer gets to see it and what feeling and mood that you bring to it. So I have a firm belief that the best camera that you can actually have to use is the one you have in your hand in the moment. And a lot of times that means that that's your phone, right? And there are some of the settings that we're going to talk about today that you can manipulate on your phone. My newest iPhone allows me to shoot in RAW. It also allows me to manipulate the exposure triangle, which I'm going to talk about in this video as we proceed forward. But the thing that it doesn't do is it doesn't make that easy. And it also doesn't have the level of sophistication in the quality of the equipment. I don't know how to explain it any better than that. It's just that big cameras take much better photos. They allow you to blow them up really big. They allow you to do a lot more with them than images that you'll take even from a modern iPhone. So I'm recording this in 2025. And at this rate, basically my iPhone is probably equivalent in a lot of ways to the very first digital camera I had. But I can tell you when I go to blow up a photo, even the images from that very first initial digital camera I had way back in like 2000, it's better than my current iPhone is. So the tech is there, but trust me, you're in for an experience and capturing images with a bigger, more professional camera. All right. So photography is the story of the moment. And I think that the first thing that you probably already are doing that I want to reiterate before I dive into a myriad of technical things that are going to make your brain swim is that never forget this is the story of the moment that's in front of you. And to become a really good photographer, it requires you to start seeing photos everywhere. And what's interesting is I hang out with photographers a lot. I have two business partners in Cowgirls with Cameras, Phyllis and Kara, and we spend a lot of time in vehicles together. And trust me, our conversations are talking about, oh, wow, wouldn't it be cool to take a photo there? Or I see an image there, or I see a place there that would be interesting to shoot. We are always looking at the photo in everything we do, whether there's a horse in it or not. Now, if you put a horse in it, we're even more excited. So begin to start seeing the story around you. Ask yourself, whose story is this? What is the essence of that moment? And how could you best capture and relay that feeling to yourself as a memory or to someone else? And at its essence, you are looking for that feeling and being able to evoke it. So it is about that elicitation of a feeling that gets people to really draw themselves into the photo and to use the technology and the tools that you have in your hand to be able to capture that particular moment in time. All right. So the very first place that we're going to start is we're going to move from using a camera, likely in your case, a camera that doesn't have an interchangeable lens. So in other words, we can't take the lens off of the camera and put a different one on. So the lady that's in this photo here is the lovely Jennifer from Dry Head. It's a place where we hold a photography retreat every single summer. And Jennifer is an amazing photographer, and she's holding in her hand what I would consider a prosumer or high-end hobbyist interchangeable lens camera. And it's at the basic level, and that's perfectly fine. Jennifer actually captures beautiful images with this camera, and she uses it to document the things they do on their ranch and also to document things that their guests do so that the guests can remember the experience. So she's a wonderful photographer and a wonderful lady. And if you join us at Dry Head, you get to meet Jennifer. But basically what we're looking for is a camera that you can remove and do different lenses with. Most cameras that are in that category are going to fall into one of two types. There's either a DSLR, which is a digital single lens reflex camera, or a mirrorless camera. Now, all of these cameras that I'm going to talk about today are in a 35 millimeter format. That means that basically the sensor size inside the camera is roughly equivalent to a 35 millimeter piece of film. Now, there is an exception to that. There are cameras that have what's called an APS-C sensor in them, which is much smaller, but the actual photo that pops out of it, the proportion, is equivalent to what you would have with a 35 millimeter camera. You may be wondering, well, is there something else beyond that? Well, yeah, actually there is. There are medium format cameras and even large format cameras that have much larger, what I would consider in the film world, a negative size. And as digital has progressed, they also have much larger sensors, and they have different crop ratios, and different proportions to the output photo. So those different formats are also available. They tend to be in the really high-end expensive cameras though. And we're talking about not cheap cameras here by any stretch of the imagination, but we want something that is in the budget of most normal photography, serious hobbyists and business owners. So we are going to stick into the 35 millimeter world, but we are looking for that interchangeable lens camera. When we came from film to digital, film cameras had a mirror inside of them, and it's part of how the camera works. I'm not going to dig into that, but they had a mirror and an actual shutter that opened and closed. As technology has improved, we have new options in cameras that are called mirrorless. And so that mirror and the actual shutter is now digital and electronic. So it doesn't really exist anymore. As a matter of fact, you can turn on and off the shutter sound, because those of us who have been around a while, and especially like me who've come from the film world, we really like that click, right? It's a satisfying noise. And your mirrorless camera doesn't need it, because that's actually the sound of the shutter, and you don't need it any longer. But you can turn it on and feel comfortable with it if that's something that you're used to. At any rate, either one of them will work in the 35 millimeter format. When you're looking at this level of equipment, a lot of people are like, what is my investment going to be for this? And I can tell you, you can invest as little as $3,000 to $5,000 or as much as 8 to 10,000 depending upon the model that you pick, whether you choose used or new, whether you go with a mirrorless or a DSLR, and whether you go with name brand lenses or off brand lenses. So there's a lot of latitude in investing in this equipment, but in general, you're going to plan between lens and a camera at the low end, spending somewhere around $3,000, and at the upper end, spending between 8 and 12. So it's expensive. And it's a thing where you look at it and go, oh my gosh, I don't even know if I'm going to like it yet. So you can rent equipment. And here's what I want you to remember when you're renting equipment, especially when you're learning. The more expensive the camera, the more professional level that it is, the easier it is to use. So it kind of goes up from consumer to high-end professional. And at the high-end professional, we're using manual mode. We're really making a lot of decisions for the scene that we're in, and we use our camera as a partner in helping be able to tell us what we would do, but we ultimately have control over that image. And cameras at that level are built to easily make decisions for exposure and for other creative controls. At the lower end of that price range, you have cameras that are designed for hobbyists or people that are dipping their toe into the world of photography. And so the camera actually makes it easier for you to use modes that have you making less decisions or fewer decisions about how that particular image comes out. And so it actually makes it harder to do some of the things that I am talking about in this presentation when we're going to learn about photography. Like, we're going to learn about exposure, and we're going to learn how to control the feeling of our photo by manipulating things within the exposure of our image. And so the higher, more end, top end professional cameras are easier to learn that on. So you may want to rent a more expensive rig before you invest even in a less expensive rig. Another thing to consider when it comes to pricing on cameras is a DSLR is a fading technology. Like, most people are moving on to mirrorless, and I see DSLRs fading out of our favor within a few years. They're not dead yet by any stretch of the imagination, but they are fading out. Like, camera manufacturers are pulling way back on those, and they're putting their manufacturing time and effort into mirrorless cameras. So DSLR cameras, since a lot of professionals are moving to the mirrorless, have become less expensive, and you can buy really nice DSLRs used that are much less expensive than investing in a similar level mirrorless camera. So there's a lot to think about there. Also, mirrorless is developing really quickly. And so there's out-of-date models that take absolutely gorgeous photos that are going to be less expensive than the current in-date camera models. So those are all things to consider when you're thinking about purchasing a camera. But when you're learning, I can tell you a mirrorless is going to help you learn faster because it has an electronic shutter, which means that when you look through the viewfinder and you adjust your settings that we're going to talk about in this video, you can see in real time with real feedback through the viewfinder exactly what effect changing that setting is going to have on your image. And a DSLR camera does not have that opportunity for you. It's not the same because it doesn't have that very live feedback. And so as you're learning exposure, which can sound simple, but get extremely complicated, it helps you be able to get that instant feedback. And I do say that it's easier to learn photography in digital photography because you do get instant feedback. Even if you have a DSLR and you shoot a photo and you look at the back of your camera and hit play, you can instantaneously see, did you overexpose that? Did you underexpose it? Back in the day when I was learning and I had to learn on film, yep, I'm the woman walking uphill both ways to school, right? I earned these gray hairs. I always say that. But I didn't have that. I would take my film to the processor or I would take it to the darkroom, which I absolutely hated. But I would take it and then I would see how poor or good of a job I did at getting the photos properly exposed. It was a different beast back then. And trust me, I went to digital and never looked back. My film camera, I wrapped it all up and put it up and thought, oh, I'll pick this back up again. That was 2000 and I ain't touched it since. I do still think it's in my closet, however. All right. So there are major, and I call them photography houses. Yes, I'm a Harry Potter fan. You kind of get sorted into your house, and the way that you get sorted into your house is not a fun hat. It's usually, or a snarky hat, as in the case of Harry Potter, but it's usually some other a circumstance that you find yourself in, and you are suddenly in a brand of camera, and now you're kind of in that house for life. For me personally, the first camera that I purchased was an AE1 from Canon. And kind of once you buy into one brand, like all of the things fit that brand that are in that brand, and you tend to stay with them forever. I was 13 years old. It's like choosing a side of the bed when you get married. I mean, it was just like, wasn't a mindful choice. That was what I purchased. That was what I picked out and wanted. And that was what I got. And so Canon, I am in-house Canon. The good news is whether you choose house Canon, house Nikon, or house Sony, or any of the other houses that are kind of what I would consider lesser houses, there's not as many photographers in them. The equipment is very equivalent across the board. Even though Phyllis and Kara and I shoot Canon and Phyllis shoots Nikon, we give each other a lot of grief about Canon and Nikon, and we argue about whose camera is better or whose. In general, if Canon comes out with something, Nikon will have it in a hot minute. And if Nikon comes out with something, Canon will have it in a hot minute. And Sony is either on the cutting edge or they're just right there with them. So any of these three brands of cameras, you can't go wrong with. You will be able to find a lot more information online about Canon, Nikon, and Sony than you will about Fuji, Pentax, Panasonic, and Olympus. So there's also nothing wrong with any of the other brands that I listed there. We've had all of those come to our workshops, and all of them have taken really beautiful photos. I have worked with people who have the Fujifilm cameras. I always get the weird brands as the one of us who works with those students. And the Fuji cameras are very similar to what I shot on film cameras. And so if you were an old school film person and then you're like revived into using your phone, Fuji has a lot of capability around that. It feels like an older film camera does in your hand. And for some people that's comforting. All good. I personally don't want to pick up my film camera ever again. So I'm going to give you some popular models that are on the professional side. These are not like low-end consumer cameras. These are high-end hobbyist, moving toward professional or at the professional level, for the two brands Canon and Nikon, because I do believe Canon and Nikon tend to be the two most popular choices out there. So those are the two that I know. Those are the two that we shoot within Cowgirls with Cameras. So they're the ones I'm most able to answer questions about when it comes to camera models. So Canon, I would recommend in the mirrorless versions, R5 or R6. These are both going to be full frame. I believe the R6 is a full frame camera. I know the R5 is because that's the camera that I personally use. So remember, full frame is the full 35 millimeter negative side. APS-C is a smaller sensor, but I've seen those take equivalently as good photos, just FYI. There's nothing detrimental or wrong with the smaller sensor. Okay. The only thing that changes is that the lenses you use need to be made for an APS-C camera, or you will have a crop ratio if you use a full frame lens. So you do need to know which your camera body is to appropriately choose the lens that you're going to work with. So R5, R6 for mirrorless on Canon, 5D, 6D for the DSLRs. And again, it's up to you which one you do. The R5 is going to be considerably more expensive than the 5D. By the way, Canon puts Mark blah, blah, blah after their numbers. And I think that R5 is currently on Mark 2. And I think the 5D kind of maxed out at Mark 4. So the higher the Mark number in Canon nomenclature, the more current that camera is. So the more bells and whistles and the more modern that it is. So make sure you look at what mark the camera is when you're looking at it. If it's significantly cheaper, it probably is an earlier mark. And thus does not have as many bells and whistles. And when you are looking for videos online, for tutorial kind of videos for any specific camera, you need to look at the model number as well as like the iteration of whatever that camera is. That's Canon's world. Nikon I am not as familiar with, and I will readily admit that. That is Phyllis's bailiwick. She is excellent at it, so I don't learn it. And her information that she gave me was a Z6, Z7, Z8. Z9 is the top-end professional on the mirrorless side of things. It's a top-end professional. I'm sure Nikon has others. But those are some model numbers that you might consider in the mirrorless category, D500 and D750 in the DSLR category. These are just suggestions. Take a look at the camera. You can actually lose yourself for weeks in figuring out the differences in the cameras. And if that is something that is important to you, I send you Godspeed to all of that. But if it's not something and you want to just get to shooting, pick one and drive, because you'll be fine. You'll be fine. Every single camera that I've listed here, as well as a myriad of others that are less expensive and more expensive, will all get you through the content in this video and on to taking professional level photos. So now that you have your body picked, we need to work on your lenses, getting a lens for you. So you want to make sure you match the lens that you get to the body that you chose. So if you chose an APS-C size sensor body, you're going to want to make sure you use APS-C size lenses. Now, full frame lenses will work on an APS-C size body, but there's going to be what's called a crop ratio, which means that the low number in the focal length of the lens is going to be more zoomed in. In other words, it's closer up. You're not going to have the full width of what you think you do as written on the lens. So choose lenses that fit the body that you have chosen for your camera body accordingly. Now, there's a myriad of lenses out in the world, and there's all kinds of specialty ones. We're not going to get into that here. Most people at the stage of the people watching this video, there's two things you need to understand about your lenses, or two types of lenses: fixed or prime. That means the same thing, and it means that lens photographs things at a single focal length, like 50 millimeter or 100 millimeter or 200 millimeter or 400 millimeter. And that's the only focal length that lens works at. And then there are zoom lenses that work at a range of focal lengths. So that can be a 70 to 200 or an 18 to 35 or a 100 to 300 millimeter lens. That lens will have focal lengths that are from the lowest number to the highest number. Zoom lenses are fantastic for equine photographers because we have a lot of need to both get up close and far away. So they tend to be the choice of most equine photographers. A lot of portrait photographers or studio photographers choose a fixed focal length lens because they tend to work in one place. Their camera is on a tripod. Their subject is always pretty much the same distance from the camera. They may move around some, but not a tremendous amount. So a fixed focal length works great. If you're going to use fixed focal length in any type of equine photography, you have to understand that you are the zoom. So you're going to have to use your feet to get closer or further away. And it's an interesting artistic experiment and exploration for photographers that are used to shooting with zoom lenses to go ahead and shoot with a fixed or a prime lens, because it gives you a different perspective in it. It like puts a little twist on your art. But at the stage that you're at, you're learning. And so sometimes having the zoom lens might make that a little bit easier. The thing that you need to know for equine photography is probably 85 to 95% of the images that most equine photographers shoot are going to be shot with a 70 to 200. Now, there are times that we want to have a wider angle, which is going to be a wide angle is basically anything below 35 millimeters. So 18, 14, 16, there's even gets further wide angle than that. And the distortion in a wide angle lens is really pronounced the smaller the number becomes, because horses are really these angular beings with lots of long lines. They become easily distorted in wide angle lenses, which is one of the reasons why your horse may not look so great when you take his photo with your iPhone. The lens in an iPhone tends to default to that really wide angle sort of feeling to it, because most people with their iPhones are capturing scenes, right? They're not zooming in or detailing on a horse. And because of the angles of the horse, they can look bizarre and awkward and not at all what horse people think horses should look like. But when we zoom in, it means we have to get back from the subject, and that invokes something else called compression, and it kind of pulls all the angles of the horse together, and then they look really cool and majestic, like we all want them to look in our imagination, correct? So zoom lenses are very popular with equine photographers because they let us hit a range of focal lengths with the very same lens without changing lenses and without doing a tremendous amount of moving around. So the 70 to 200 is our go-to lens. Now, lenses have other numbers involved with them other than the focal length. And we're going to look at the front of a lens on the next slide. And I'm going to explain to you how to understand how to read the front end of your lens. But for now, what I need you to understand is that inside the lens, there is an aperture. And that aperture or hole opens. The numbers 2.8 and 4 mean that lens is really, really wide open. A bigger number like a 16 and 18, 22, somewhere in there, means that hole or aperture is a lot smaller. This is one of the harder things for photographers to grasp onto, is that the bigger that number gets, the smaller the hole gets, right? In your head, that's how you calculate it. But what we have to remember is that aperture is actually measured in a fraction. So 2.8 is actually much bigger than 1 over 2.8 than 1/116th. So maybe that helps. I don't know. It didn't help me. I just had to come to grips with the fact that f16 is a much smaller hole in my lens than 2.8. The bigger the aperture opens, the more light is allowed into the sensor. And also in that, the better the glass in the lens has to be in order to not distort the image and to be able to capture everything correctly. So lenses that are 2.8 are going to be much more expensive than lenses that are at 4.0. And by the way, this is considered an f-stop. I'm rattling these numbers off without putting the F in front of them because that's the way we talk about it. And I don't have to say the F every single time, but that's actually what it is. It's the F stop or aperture number that we're talking about here. So when you pick your lens for equine photography, either a 2.8 or a 4.0 is going to be fine. A 4.0 is going to be considerably less expensive than a 2.8, partially because that glass has to be so much better. But it does allow you to shoot at that most wide open aperture. And there are a lot of photographers who stylistically want to be able to hold that option open to be able to capture the feeling in an image, in a scene at any given moment. So rent them both and see what you use. And when you go to purchase one, buy the one that fits your budget. And if you happen to need maybe the more open aperture, the 2.8, and you bought a 4, rent it. That renting is one of our go-tos in professional photography, because I can't afford to put a 800 millimeter lens, which is tens of thousands of dollars, in my bag on a daily basis. And to be honest, I probably would use it like once every 5 years. Those are more for wildlife type photography, and I don't do that on a regular basis. It's a lot of money to invest in something that I'm going to use once every few years. But on the flip side of that, I can rent it. Still expensive to rent, but you can rent it. All right, let's understand what these numbers on the front of our lens means, because this is an important designation when you're looking at your lens and knowing the capability of what you can do when you get to understanding exposure, which is the whole next part of this presentation. So on the front here, we have the letters EF-S. So that tells me that this is a Canon lens, and I can see the little 60D in the corner down there, and I happen to know that's a Canon model number, but Canon's DSLR lenses are EF lenses. The mirrorless ones are RF lenses. So I happen to know this is a Canon lens, or at least it fits a Canon camera. It may not be made by Canon, but it's designed for a Canon DSLR camera. And the S on the end of it, I don't know specifically, but my guess is that designates it as an APS size C, or size, yeah, APS-C lens. I don't know that for sure, but that's a designation. And if you don't know what it is, Google it. I should have Googled it before I did this presentation. I grabbed this photo off of stock art, so I don't know for sure, but it gets our point across. Those letters mean something. Then we have 18 to 55 millimeter. So we already know that this is a zoom lens because the word zoom is printed on it, but that gives me the focal range of this particular lens. It'll start at 18 and it'll go to 55 millimeter. So in that focal range, this one has the more complex of the two configurations of numbers that come next. The next number that you'll see is the maximum aperture that this particular lens can handle. So if you have a 2.8 and you have a zoom that is 2.8 throughout the entire focal length, you will only see 2.8 as those numbers. If you have an f4, 70 to 200, it will say 70-200, and then the next number will be 4.0. In this lens, we have a range of numbers. It has 1:3.5-5.6. And what that tells me is that at 18 millimeter, the maximum aperture, so when you're at 18 millimeter focal length, the maximum aperture that this lens can handle is a 3.5. If I zoom into 55 though, and I'm using the 55 focal length, I will only be able to have a maximum aperture of 5.6. So that range of numbers is really important when you're looking at lenses to purchase. This lens, well, first 18 to 55 would not make a great portrait lens in my opinion, but some people really like the wider angle portrait lenses. But 5.6 is a pretty small aperture for doing that bokeh feeling that you get. So you're not going to get nearly as creamy a background at the 55 millimeter as you could at the 18 millimeter, but at 18 millimeter, things are going to be distorted. So see, everything in photography is a compromise. So you kind of have to look at things accordingly and choose your equipment accordingly. But now you know how to read the numbers on the front of the lens. The next thing I want to point out is there's the letters IS on this particular lens. And IS in this case stands for image stabilization, which means this lens inside of its little electronic motor has the ability to stabilize some of the camera movement, either from the person or from the subject. So the photographer themselves can move and cause camera movement, and also the subject moving. It can help you take clear, crisp photos with frozen action at a lower shutter speed than would be possible without the image stabilization. and handheld. If you're working handheld, it'll let you use a slower shutter speed. We're going to cover why that is in the exposure part of this presentation, but I just want to mention it here that the image stabilization, this lens has image stabilization. One other number, and it's in the lower little left-hand corner down there, is the 58 millimeter. So that is actually, and there's a little symbol of a zero with a slash through it. That number tells us what the filter size is for this particular lens. So the filter size, or that number, is going to tell us when we go to buy a hood for this lens, when we go to replace the lens cap, or if we're buying a filter that we actually want to screw onto the end of the lens, that tells us what size that particular filter, hood, or lens cap needs to be. So in this case, for this lens, that is 58 millimeter. All right, where do you rent equipment? So there's two places that I can personally recommend. There are myriads of others, but these are the two that I have used personally and can fully recommend. One is Lens Rentals. Now, if you've rented camera equipment before and you used a company called Borrow Lenses, this is the company that they now are. I think they got absorbed or purchased or something, but regardless, it's the same company. I've had great service with them. You can go to lensrentals.com. You do have to go through a little bit of a security check. I mean, they don't exactly just hand out, $40,000 worth of camera equipment to anyone who says, hey, send me the camera equipment. So there's a little bit of a check that you've got to go through. It's not bad. I was able to rent really quickly. And I've been a customer of Borrow Lenses before Lens Rentals took over. So it was a pretty easy process. They have great equipment. They've got video equipment. They've got still photography equipment. Nice company to work with. Basically, how it works is you rent it, you pay for it, you buy insurance on it. Never pass up the insurance, FYI. You buy your insurance and they pay for the shipping. They ship it to you. You use it. You reuse the box they shipped it in. They'll ship you a label to be able to send it back. And on the day it needs to be returned, you just put the label on it and take it to UPS or FedEx, whichever it is that they send it with, and back it goes. Works fantastically easily. Take good care of their equipment. Don't abuse it. And they're a great company. Rent Glass is actually my favorite source to rent equipment from. They are a local company to Kansas City, which is where I live, but they do work all over the country. And I love the folks that own this business. I like seeing their smiling faces when I walk through the door to return equipment. It's kind of nice to be able to do it in person rather than just through the mail. But I don't care where you are, you can utilize Rent Glass, and they're a great company to work with. So either of these organizations work both the same, and 5 out of 5 stars for both of them. So now you have your camera, you've unboxed it, you've got your lens on there, and now you're wanting to know how you can start learning to really control the story that you tell with your images. So now we're going to dive into understanding the exposure triangle. Now I'm going to caveat this by saying you may feel a little like you got lost in the Bermuda Triangle in some of the information that I'm about to give you, because I want you to remember the very first thing I told you in this presentation, in this video, was that photography is the most complex, simple thing you will ever learn how to do. And the exposure triangle throws a lot of people for a loop. So just know that if you listen to this, watch it, think, I got this, go grab your camera and go out to shoot, and then you all of a sudden have this realization, I don't got this. I got to go watch it again. None of it makes sense when I'm holding my camera. It's okay. That happens to a lot of us. I will readily admit I was a really well-paid professional photographer before I fully understood all of the ramifications of the exposure triangle. And the interesting exploration that I've been on for the last 30 plus years since then has been to figure out how to teach it to people. And I can tell you it is a complex subject. I have been through this discussion with literally hundreds or if not thousands of students at this point. And it's a very simple concept to think you understand, but then to put into use, it gets more and more complex. I will tell you at some point There will be a beautiful singing of the angels, and it will bring you to enlightenment. But for now, just hang in there with me as we go through this explanation, and hopefully this will help you get to the clouds parting, angels singing part faster. All right. So there are 3 components, hence the triangle scenario of exposure. And those 3 components are aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. Now, each component also controls another aspect of how your image comes out. And the first one we're going to talk about is aperture. And aperture controls how much light is allowed to actually touch the shutter, and it does that through the aperture in the lens. So if you look at the photo above the word aperture, you'll see that little hole. That's exactly what it looks like inside of a lens. And the bigger that hole is, the more light is allowed in, obviously, and the smaller the hole, the less light is allowed in. But it also affects the depth of field of your image. And the best way for me to explain that is by utilizing the video of myself right here. Now, I'm going to say right up front that this particular depth of field situation with this video camera has a lot more to do with like digital components of a filter that is applied through my computer to kind of blur out the background and the foreground. But you're going to be able to accomplish this in your camera using your aperture. So 3 parts of your photo: you have the foreground, you have the subject, and then you have the background. Your focal point should be on the subject, and then depending upon the aperture that you're using, how blurred the foreground and the background are going to be. And what that does is, just like watching this video, it isolates me so that you're able to see my face, my facial expressions, and you don't get distracted by all of the details in the plant behind me or all of the details in the microphone stand in front of me. So it's a way that we can isolate in as photographers on exactly the part of the scene we want to focus our viewers' attention on. So just know aperture controls the depth of field. So how in focus things are, the smaller the hole or the higher the number. So F16, F18, that means that the more in focus foreground to background the image is going to be, the bigger the aperture and what we conceive as the smaller of the numbers, like the 2.8 or F4, that means the more of the foreground and the more of the background is going to be blurry. So that's another reason, like I said, we want those really big apertures. So we want lenses that have the ability for us to do that, because it allows us to isolate our subject even more. And it's usually one of the very first defining features that you'll notice in your photos when you step up to a bigger camera, to a bigger, more expensive professional level type camera, is that you will notice that you're able to do that. iPhone cameras shoot at a wide angle, and they tend to utilize, unless you're using the portrait mode, which has started to teach people this concept, they tend to keep things at a pretty small aperture so that things are in focus foreground to background. Because a lot of times we're capturing snapshots, and snapshots, we like a lot of the things to be in focus in a snapshot. But when we're creating art and we're creating images that tell a story, we want to have control over that aspect of our image. All right, the next thing I want to talk about is shutter speed. So shutter speed controls how much time the light is allowed to touch the sensor in your camera. And it controls the ability to blur or to freeze the action that is happening in front of you. The higher the shutter speed, so the higher the number in the shutter speed, the better you will be able to freeze the action. The lower the number, the more chances you are to have the moving parts in your scene have a little bit of blur to them. And that can be from a small amount of blur to an extreme amount of blur. So sometimes we do it on purpose. There's a technique in photography called panning, where we purposefully blur a lot of the image so that you focus in on just one little piece of what's moving across the scene. It's It's very hard to do. You will take a lot of exposures when you're learning how to do panning. Actually, even once you've learned how to do panning, you will take a lot of exposures to get it right. So shutter speed controls how much light touches the sensor and then how much you are freezing the action in front of you. ISO controls how sensitive the sensor is to the light coming in through the aperture and the shutter speed. And the more sensitive the sensor is, the more noise will be in your image. So let me explain what I mean by that. So when the sensor is at a high ISO or incredibly sensitive to light, that means that you can take photos in darker locations, right? So it can be very, very dark in the room, and you're able to actually utilize what little light is there in order and reflecting off your subject in order to get a photo. But typically in these situations, there's lots of shadows. And in those shadows, there's still information that is collected by the camera. And when the sensor is set to be super sensitive, it's going to collect more of that noise. And generally it shows up as like a grainy sort of whitish type of noise. It'll make, and sometimes it's multicolored. It just makes your image look really weird. So we don't want to have a tremendous amount of noise in our images. And again, most complex, simple thing you will ever do. We want to be able to compromise to keep our ISO as low as we possibly can and still capture the moment. So again, it's all a big compromise. So ISO controls how sensitive your sensor is and how much noise is actually in the resultant image. So how do you figure all of this out? Well, inside your camera, there is a meter and it reads the light on the scene. Now, cameras have what we call different metering modes. Most cameras have 3 metering modes. They have what's called center weighted. So wherever your focal point is, and in this picture that I have here, which I excuse it for being a little bit out of focus, it is a stock art piece. I have to say that as a photographer. You will say that eventually about other things, but it demonstrates exactly what I wanted to talk about, right? So the little square in the middle is the actual focal point. And in center weighted, the light that's going to be judged is going to be based upon the center of the entire frame. There's also spot metering, which would be exactly at that point. And if the point were off to the left or off to the right or way up or way down, the meter would read the light wherever that point moved to. And then there's evaluative, which will take a look at the entire scene, bright or dark, and be able to evaluate or average what the exposure would be to get it the most correct across the entire scene. For people starting out, I really recommend that you use evaluative metering inside your camera to at least start out with. And a lot of times in equine photography, horses are big and they take up a lot of the frame in our photos. And so evaluative metering is kind of our go-to. There are other times you may want to use spot metering or center weighted. So get to know them, but when you're learning, evaluative is great. When we look at the photo that this camera is sort of set on, or the scene it is, we have a lot of light, we have dark, and we have sort of mid-tones in that image. And so what the camera is doing, if it's using evaluative metering, is it's looking at all of that and giving us the best exposure that it could recommend for that. Now, you'll notice that this camera has the M in the upper left-hand corner. That means it's on manual mode. So that means that the user is setting the shutter speed, the aperture, and the ISO. And those 3 numbers in our exposure triangle are listed right along the bottom of the viewfinder. We know in this particular case that this camera is set at a shutter speed of 1/15 of a second, which is incredibly slow, FYI. And a f-stop of f13, which is incredibly high, and then an ISO of 320. So our sensitivity of our sensor is set at 320, which in the scheme of things is not very sensitive. The f-stop, the aperture is very closed because it's at f13, and the shutter speed is very slow at 1/15 of a second. And I'm going to give you some parameters later on for equine photography and action photography, as well as portrait kind of stuff, that are going to give you some baselines for where you should start to think that these numbers need to be, like minimums and maximums of what you need to do specifically for equine photography. So this may be where this person just set the camera and they metered this scene, and this just happened to be where their settings were when they picked up the camera. And a lot of times it's where we start. So over on the right-hand side of this particular camera, you'll see a scale. So you see it goes from a negative to a positive, and there's a 0 in the middle. This is your actual light meter. And 0 means that you're at what the camera considers the correct exposure for whatever metering mode that you have chosen. So if we've chosen evaluative, it's going to tell you that the correct exposure when you move the dials for shutter speed, aperture, and ISO, when you have those dialed in correctly, the little line should be at the 0. Now, this particular camera looks like what is using something called exposure bracketing, which means that it's actually going to take like 3 images, and 2 of those are probably going to be underexposed. A lot of cameras, it's just one single line. Okay. Some camera models tend to overexpose, or they tend to lean towards the lighter side of images. Others tend to lean towards the darker side. In Canon's world, which I've shot for multitudes of years, I like to underexpose my images by 1/3 stop, because I feel like the sensor inside the camera, or the meter inside the camera, always leans towards the overexposed side. I will tell you, in the scheme of over and underexposing your images, it is easier to recover detail in an underexposed image than it is to regain detail that was lost in an overexposed image. Overexposed is going to be too white. Underexposed is going to be too black. So the darks are underexposed. The lights are overexposed. When you look at this meter, the meter is divided in what is called 1/3 stops. So we've been talking about f-stops, and we've been talking about shutter speeds, and I've been rattling off a bunch of numbers that probably don't make a lot of sense to you at this point. But as we get further into this, those numbers are going to start to coalesce into something called stops. And it's 1 stop per set of numbers. And I have a chart for you here in a little bit that is going to help further explain that concept. But your camera generally works not in full stops, but in 1/3 of that stop. So to get from one stop to another stop, basically whatever button or dial you're pushing, you're going to have to manipulate it 3 times in order to get 1 full stop. That will make more sense here in a moment. All right, so you have your meter. If your little line in your meter is on between the 0 and the plus, that means you have too much light coming into your camera. If it is between the 0 and the minus, you don't have enough light coming in to your camera and to your sensor. So you need to adjust the 3 settings in your exposure triangle in order to, if it's between the 0 and the minus, allow more light to the sensor. And if it's between the 0 and the plus, to reduce the amount of light that is hitting the sensor. So when you're looking through your viewfinder, and by the way, this is on the back of this camera, but it's also the same scene you're going to look through if you looked through the actual viewfinder. This information will be inside your camera, and it may be in a different place. In mine, the little meter is down at the bottom, and the exposure numbers sit below it or atop of it. So there's a lot of different ways that it's going to look, but some representation, whatever camera model you get, some representation of this is going to be inside of it. All right. Remember, I told you if all of this is horribly confusing, you're like, oh my God, it sounded so simple. We started with 3 things. Why did it get so complicated? One day, the clouds of confusion will part, the light will rush in, and everything will be clear. I promise. Have faith, keep trying, and just keep shooting until that day gets here. Many times when photographers talk to you about exposure, they talk to you about it in the concept of, or metaphor with, a triangle. And there's a reason for this, because it helps us be able to determine a little bit about how these 3 elements work together and how shifting and changing on one side of the triangle affects what happens on the other side of the triangle. So this is what I believe is a really good representation of what the exposure triangle is. So on one side of the triangle, we have shutter speed, and on the other side of the triangle, we have aperture, and at the base of the triangle, we have ISO. Realistically, when I am shooting, I pick my ISO based on the light that is available. And yes, I will adjust it by metering, but I've been doing this for a hot minute, and I can look outside and I can say it's really bright and sunny. There's like no clouds in the sky. I can use a really low ISO because I don't need my sensor to be sensitive to light, because there is an abundance of it. And if I walk into a dark building, I know that it's exactly the opposite of that. I don't have an abundance of light, so I need to make my sensor more sensitive to light. And I have to remember that there is a compromise on that upper end. The more sensitive I make the sensor, the more noise or grain that I'm going to get in my photo. This particular graphic uses the word grain. Grain and noise are roughly interchangeable. So the more grain I'm going to get. So I need to know that I don't want it to go above a certain amount, but I also want to be able to freeze motion or blur it as I see fit, and also capture the depth of field with my aperture that I see fit. So for me personally, what I do is look, if it's bright and sunny, I'm going to set an ISO somewhere between 200 and 400, maybe even as low as 100, depending on how much light I have. And as things continue to get dark, I'm going to choose ISOs of 1600 or 3200. I rarely, if ever, go above 3200. Most modern cameras are capable of handling a 3200 ISO. Some DSLRs are not. They don't go as high. A lot of the newer mirrorless ones don't struggle even at 3200. But I try not to get too far above 3200 because most of my work ends up getting printed in something that requires it to be enlarged. And when you enlarge any flaw in your photo, you really make it a lot more obvious. And noise is one of the more common things that becomes a flaw in a photo. So just be aware that the higher that number is, the more noise you're going to have and the less latitude you're going to have on the other end of the photo. All right, baseline set. And I like that it's at the bottom of the triangle. Now I have one number set, and I got to determine based on the other 2 numbers, which of those other factors that I talked about is the most important to me. Is my aperture the most important? So in other words, isolating my subject or making sure I have a really deep depth of field from foreground to background. So in the first case scenario, isolating my subject would be like a portrait, and a landscape photo would be wanting to have a tremendous amount of depth of field. If I'm in a portrait, I want my aperture to be more open because that blurs the foreground and blurs the background. And if I am shooting a landscape, I want things to be really in focus from the foreground to the background. So I'm going to choose a more closed aperture. So as you look at this diagram, you can see as the numbers get smaller towards the top of the pyramid, the aperture actually gets more open. This is probably the most confusing part of this whole process, is that aperture is not as intuitive as the other 2 numbers. Okay. So we have to remember apertures are fractions, and hopefully if you're a math-minded person, that makes sense to you. And all of a sudden it's unlocked a big key of this. However, if you're like me and math is a big struggle, I lived on the liberal arts side of the college. Like I only went over to the math and science side in order to get the credits I needed to get my degree. It's confusing over there for me. art side, great. But this is a science-y kind of thing and math kind of thing. And it helps if you think of it in fractions, I have been told. If that doesn't work for you, just remember 1 is the most open, 22 or 32 is going to be the most closed. So the bigger the number, the smaller it gets. The smaller the number, the bigger it gets. Little counterintuitive, but hey, just start thinking of it that way. So the bigger the number, the more shallow the depth of field is. The smaller the number, the more shallow the depth of field is. The bigger the number, the more depth of field you have. Look at the diagram and just kind of start to coalesce what number goes with what thing. Most lenses are not going to go down to 1. They're going to stop at 2.8. And most lenses will go above 32 or above 22. A lot of them will go up to 32. So that hole gets super, super small. So just look at that and ask yourself, is that the most important factor, or is freezing motion the most important factor? If freezing motion is the most important factor, then that's the next number we set. If depth of field is the most important factor, then that's the next number we set. So ISO first, and then whichever of the 2 other sides of the triangle is the most important to you for telling the story in this scene. All 3 numbers have to work together, but you have to rank them as an artist into which ones get the most priority. So let's say we're doing a portrait. We're going to want a relatively open aperture. So we're going to pick a 2.8 or a 4. So now we have our 2 numbers and we need to balance it with our shutter speed. Okay. So we set those 2 numbers, and then we look at the meter in our viewfinder and see if we're on the minus to 0 or 0 to plus. And if we're 0 to plus, we have to take our shutter speed up. We want it to go faster because we have more light. We need to take light away. So we need to reduce the amount of time that our shutter is open so we have less light on the sensor. If it is from the minus to the 0, we need to allow more light in. So we need to slow our shutter down so that we allow more time for the light to hit the sensor. Okay, simple as that. Now, shutter speed on the other side works the same way. So let's say we look at our scene and we've got a cowboy chasing a cow. We know that in order to freeze the action, we need at least 1/1000th of on our shutter speed. So we set 1/1000, look at our meter and see, okay, in order to do that, if it is the 0 to plus, if our little line is there, then we need to take away light. So we're going to choose an aperture that is more closed or a bigger number. And if it's from the minus to the 0, then we need to add light, which means we need a more open aperture, which means we're going to choose a number that is towards the top of the pyramid or smaller. Okay, with me so far? All right. This will really help solidify what I have just said. This is a stops chart. So this chart shows you full stops and 1/3 stops for exposure for shutter, aperture, and ISO. When you are learning, compensation is easiest because what we just did was compensation, right? We have 2 numbers. We need to figure out the 3rd. So we need to take those 2 numbers, figure out what we want for the 3rd number. That affects what our exposure finally comes out to be. It's easier in the beginning to think of them in full stops. So a full stop is either double or half. So if you're going down, it will take whatever that is, the number is, and it will reduce it by half. Sometimes the numbers don't exactly match. Don't sue me. I didn't make the system. In aperture, it's the same way. In ISO, it's the same way. In shutter, it's the same way. It's 50%. So from one stop to the other in shutter means the shutter snaps twice as fast. If you go the opposite direction, it takes twice as long. So the twice as much light gets in. Same thing for aperture. It doubles in size or reduces by half. That helped me a little bit when I was learning this. So hopefully that helps you as well. But know that the blue lines on this chart are full stops. Your camera sort of hamstrings you a little in learning this because it lives in the world of third stops, which from the point of view of having fine control over something, which is what we want our cameras to allow us to do, is great news. But in learning it, it adds a complexity. The best thing I can tell you is whatever dial you are dialing, you want it to have 3 clicks to get to a full stop. So if you are moving from 1/60th shutter speed to 1/125th shutter speed, if you ramp your shutter speed up 3 clicks, you will have gone 1 full stop. That's why our little chart is in 1/3. I am attaching a link where you can get this chart to download to this video so that you're able to download it and print it and utilize it. If you are an equine photographer, I have also included some starting guidelines for equine photographers. Shutter speed minimums, handheld portraits, 500. Horses move. Humans can kind of sit still long enough if you need to use a 250th or 1/125th shutter speed. Horses, no. They twitch and move all of the time, so it's best to use 500 or above. If you personally shake or you have not a steady hand, you might even have to go higher than that. So just choose accordingly. If you want to freeze action, you need to be at 1/1000th of a shutter speed. ISO, I've already said maximums between 1600 and 3200. Anything more than that, you're going to get a lot of noise. There are sometimes you have to go there anyway. Aim to get, if you go, commit. So if you decide to use a ISO higher, make sure you commit and make sure you get the most perfect exposure you can, because that will allow you to use tools to reduce the noise. So digital tools that will reduce that noise. For focal length, wide angle 14 to 35 is going to cause distortion, but there are times that we want that. Kara takes these great photos of like horses being horses, that horse is a horse, of course, kind of look. It's fun, and it makes for interesting photos. It also allows us to capture landscapes in some of the places we go while we're waiting for the photos or waiting for the horses to show up. Scenic to landscape 24 to 70. That's a great focal range for that. Portrait 100 to 200, and then long lenses 200 millimeter and above. Autofocus modes, I just want to cover really quickly. I've already talked about the light metering modes, so I'm going to kind of divert from our exposure triangle for just 1 second to explain this. When your camera is focusing, it has different modes. Canon has 3 modes. I haven't shot Nikon enough to know much more. I know Phyllis filled me in for this particular document that I made for our students. But in Canon's world, we have AI focus, one shot, and servo. I never use the AI focus one. It's supposed to choose between servo and one shot according to whatever the circumstances are. I have not found it useful. So I want to choose. I'm either going to say I'm going to use servo or I am going to use one shot. In Nikon's world, continuous focus is the word that Canon has for servo. So actually I think Nikon's makes more sense because that's what it is. Basically what this means is it's how your photo or how your camera decides to focus on whatever focal point you have put in. So the little square that shows up in your viewfinder, when you put it over something, when you press your button halfway down, or if you're using back button focus, press your button all of the way down, that sets the focal point. If it is set on one shot and you move your camera, wherever that focal point is in the new framing or in the new scene, that's what's going to be in focus. And if you're using continuous, wherever it's going to focus on wherever that focal point is in the new scene. The reason this is important for equine photographers is because our subjects a lot of times move not only parallel to us, but also back and forth or perpendicular to us. So they may be coming at us or moving away from us. And we want to make sure our cameras keep up with the focus of that. And that's going to be continuous focus. So the camera is always thinking about the focal point, and it's always changing the focus of the subject that it is over the top of as it comes in and out in the depth of field. If it is one shot, it's wherever you pressed that focus button, that's where the focus is going to be. So if you pressed the button, focused, and the horse has made it 25 feet in that time that it takes you to press the shutter button, that means that that horse is going to be out of focus. Probably going to catch you're going to catch the background in the scenario I just gave you. So you do want to choose your focus mode for your camera appropriately. So typically, I match that with whatever I want for my aperture or my shutter speed, whichever one is the priority. If I'm shooting portraits, I want one shot because sometimes I want to be able to focus on the eye and then like recompose my photo to make it more pleasing in the composition. And that means I want the eye to stay in focus, but I'm going to move my camera. If I have a moving horse, I'm going to want shutter speed and I'm going to want servo. So usually I tie those. It's not 100%, but I tie those to what is the priority in my exposure. All right. So exposure compensation. Let's work through some mathematical problems using our chart and knowing about the meter in our camera. So let's say we have gotten our camera and we've metered a scene, and the settings that we have arrived on initially are 1/500th of a second, f5.6, and an ISO of 1600. And now what we want to do is take artistic control over those settings. So that's our initial setting. It may or may not be what we want our final image to look like. Let's say we wanted to have less depth of field in our image. So we're wanting to add more bokeh or bokeh. So we want to shoot with a completely wide open aperture at f2.8. So now what we have to do is figure out that same exposure. We know what the exposure is. What would that exposure be with the aperture of f2.8? So there's three possible answers if we're taking f2.8, and we know we have two other arms in our triangle we can change, which would be ISO and shutter speed. So one of the answers to the equation would be 1/2000th of a second at ISO 1600. So the ISO stayed the same. And since we made the aperture bigger, we have more light and we need to use our shutter speed to reduce it. So we're going to make our shutter snap faster and allow less light into the sensor. So we've actually, it's 2 stops on our chart for what we're doing. So f2.8. So let me go back to our chart here real quick. So if we're at f2.8, which is, sorry, I'm half blind. Don't tell the world there's a blind photographer out here. All right. So we have f2.8 right here. So f2.8, and f5.6 is where we were, and we're going to go down to 2.8. That's 2 stops. So that means we have added 2 stops of light to our exposure. So we need to take 2 stops of light away from our exposure in either shutter speed or ISO. And we can choose to take it all in one section, or we can choose to divide it among the two. So if I come over here to my shutter speed, which was 500 in our correct exposure, and I need to take away, make it snap faster, 2 stops of light, I would go up to 2000. All right. If I did the same thing, 2 stops of light, and we were at 1600 for our ISO, if I needed to make the sensor less sensitive to light, so that's going up, smaller number, then I would go to 400 ISO. If that would give me 2 stops there, or I can split the difference and I can go from, if I'm at 2.8 and 500, I can add 1/1000 and I can do 800 for my ISO. So if I look at my slide that has this on here, that's the calculations that I came up with. The first one takes both stops out of the shutter speed, compensates there. The second one takes one out of each, and then the third one takes it all out of the ISO. So that's exposure compensation. So that's one way to make that decision. Let's say we have that same exposure and we're interested in freezing motion with it, which means our shutter speed needs to come up to 1/1000th of a second. We do the exact same thing. 500 to 1000 is one stop. So let's go back to our chart. So we have 500 here, and we want to go up to 1000. That means we have taken away one stop of light out of our exposure. And now we need to add that light back in. So we need to either open up our aperture, or we need to make our sensor more sensitive to light by one stop. So if we were at 5.6 and we want to add light, we are going to go to f4 because that's a bigger aperture. Or conversely, if we want to add one, here we would go from 1600 to 3200. So that's exactly what we have figured out here. So if we say 1600 is, let's say we have a lot of light in this situation, and 1600 is just overkill on the ISO. It's going to add noise that's unnecessary, and we don't want to do that. We can take, so we're figuring on our aperture and our shutter speed. If we want to reduce our ISO to 400, we're going to be back to two stops. So 1600 to 400 is two stops. So we've made the sensor in our camera less sensitive to light by two stops. So we need to add light in our shutter speed and in our aperture in order to compensate for that by two stops. And just like the original one we did with the f2.8 for adding less depth of field as our artistic decision, we can do that all in one, or we can split it amongst the two. So from 1600 to 400, we have lessened the amount of sensitivity. So we need to add or open up the aperture. So we were at 5.6, so we can go down to 2.8, or we could go to 4 and then change our shutter speed. All right, so I'm going to go back to my thing here. So you would go to 1/500th of a second at f2.8. That's going to take both of the stops out of the aperture, or add both of the stops in the aperture. If we did it in the shutter speed and the aperture, we would go with f4 and 1/250th. And then if we take both, if we add both in the shutter speed, so we're going to allow more light, so less time that the shutter, it's not going to snap as fast, it's going to snap slower. It would be 1/125th at f5.6. All right. Hopefully this has all made sense to you at this point. If it hasn't, try watching this section of the video again and go practice, which is what I want to talk about next. How can you practice this to begin to understand the effects and also practice the compensation part, where you're getting to be able to do this in your head? So there comes a point as a photographer where you no longer have to think about this. You can just start to learn how to move those dials and really partner with the meter inside your camera to get the effect that you want. You'll start to understand that moving the dials means you don't have to think about it as hard, and you can watch how the little line in your dials move. And remember, just one more time, if it's between 0 and a plus and your line is in that area, that means you need to take away light. If it's between the plus and the 0, then you need to add light to get it to the 0. All right, skills and drills. So to practice aperture, pick a static object and photograph it at different apertures. So photograph it at 2.8, at 4, and I would not recommend doing the 1/3 stops. That's a lot of images and not a lot of change. But if you go to the blue lines in that chart, that's one stop, and you'll be able to visually see how that subject changes according to what the aperture, how your image changes according to the aperture. The really cool thing about this is it's going to ask you to compensate by one stop for every single thing. So do your initial exposure and then compensate by adding or taking away light as you move your exposure and making it correct. You can take it out of your ISO, you can take it out of your shutter speed, or you can split it between the two if it's more than one stop. Shutter speed is the best way to start to practice this. Thanks to my business partner, Phyllis, for this idea, is to photograph a ceiling fan. Like find a ceiling fan or a fan and photograph it at different shutter speeds. Again, you're going to have to use your exposure compensation to get the exposure correct. But what it's going to demonstrate to you is how a slower shutter speed will allow for motion blur and how the faster shutter speeds freeze the action. Now, you will hit a terminal point on the upper end of this to where once you get past a certain shutter speed, you'll notice that it really doesn't affect the freezing of motion. Like the motion got frozen. It's not going to change it anymore. But the reason we want to have those higher shutter speeds may be to be able to control the light a little bit better. There are times, especially in equine photography, and you're needing to shoot in super bright light, and you don't want to have to compensate for it with a really, really, really small aperture. So you need those higher shutter speeds in order to compensate correctly and be able to get the image that tells the story that you want to tell. All right. And then finally for ISO, find a scene that has a lot of shadows and highlights, so lights and darks, and then use different ISOs with your exposure compensation. And then when you get your photograph in the editing software, blow it up really big and look at the detail in the shadows, and you'll be able to see where the noise is in there and to find what the tolerable level is for you. All right, so more tips for learning exposure. Cameras often always come with, and it's not often, it's always, they always have a priority mode. And the priority modes that I would recommend you use are shutter and aperture. So when you use a shutter priority or an aperture priority mode, by the way, usually the aperture priority, if it's symbols on your camera, is going to be the flower. And the shutter speed priority mode is going to be the person running. Sometimes the aperture priority is represented like by a portrait sort of thing. It's sometimes a person, but what you're looking for is the portrait setting for aperture, and what you're looking for shutter speed priority is going to be some type of sports setting. So when you have your camera in a priority mode, and this does not mean program is something different. The P is something different, and auto is even different than P. So let me back up a second. Auto sets all the settings for you. The camera makes all the decisions. P, generally what you do is set the ISO, and then the camera decides the aperture and the shutter speed in the exposure triangle. In a priority mode, you're going to set two of the things. You're going to set your ISO and then one of the other arms of the triangle to be a static number. And then the camera, based on its meter and what metering mode you have put it in, is going to decide what the correct exposure is. So it takes the math out of the equation is basically what it does. I am an advocate to keep learning how to make that compensation in your head and through the clicks on the dials on your camera, and try to do it as blindly as possible. In other words, don't be looking at it. Don't put your camera down and look. Try to get it so that you'll be able to make those setting changes without taking your camera off of the scene. That's your ultimate goal. For now, if you have to take your camera down, take it down. For now, if you need to use a priority mode to help you to be able to understand the compensation, use it. So set your camera in a priority mode and shoot like a whole bunch of stuff with just aperture priority or with just shutter priority, and get used to doing that and seeing what the result is. I find it a really nice stair step into people moving from like one of the automatic settings into moving into manual, which is scary for a lot of people, but that's our ultimate goal, is to get you to an M. I also want to tell you that if you shoot in program mode or use these priority modes, have no shame with that. Sometimes professional photographers will get a little snitty about the fact, well, you're not professional because you're not shooting an M. Ignore that. There are times I'm at an event. I have been a professional photographer for a lot of years. I have credentials. I will shoot on program because frankly, I'm walking around event taking editorial type photos, and my camera is really, really good. I have zero problems with doing that and being a professional photographer. So don't let anybody shame you, is what I'm getting at. Use your priority modes, use program. If what you're concentrating on is learning composition, sometimes that really helps because it gets the thought process of all of this tech out of the way. However, at the end of the day, the better you understand this and the more you're able to manipulate it, the better you are to control the final result. So take that for what it will. All right, shoot the same scene with different settings. Just pick a scene that is relatively static and shoot it in a lot of different settings so you can start to see what the changes are when you change your settings and what you like. Different photographers like different things. That's all a part of being an artist, right? Oil painters all have access to oil paints and brushes, and yet there's a wide range of things that come out on an oil painter's canvas. Another thing you can do is really watch the settings when you go to edit your photo. All photography editing software, and by the way, shoot in RAW. I have failed to mention that up to this point, but do shoot in RAW. It gives you the most capability when you go to edit your images. They will look a little drab when you pull them in for the first time, but all photos need developing, and I will cover a lot of the editing stuff in another video. But for now, just know that you need to edit your photos, and using RAW gives you the most data to be able to make decisions in editing. And again, moving from just pressing a button into making controlled decisions about the outcome of your image means that you want to exercise or have the most latitude for that control, and shooting in RAW allows you to do that. But they will look a little drab. So add some saturation, add some highlight, adjust your shadows and highlights accordingly, add a little vibrance, and all will be right with the world. But take note of your settings when you are playing with your photos in your editing software. Take note of what it is and ask yourself, could I have made this photo better by freezing the motion more effectively? Or could I made this photo better by isolating my subject a little more and blurring the background and the foreground? Like, what artistic decision could I have done differently? Or if you have a photo where you're seeing a lot of things that are out of focus, where was my focal point? Like, what was I doing that caused that? A lot of troubleshooting in digital photography can happen in the editing process so that you don't do it again. And then finally, shoot a lot. Remember what I said, the best camera that you have is the camera that is in your hand at the moment. And so take your camera out, and if you rent one or buy one, get attached to it. Do a lot of shooting. The more you practice, the better you're going to get at this. All right, the big move to M. Highly dramatic music should play. You can be a paid professional photographer and joyful hobbyist and be on auto, program, or priority modes. Just to want to reiterate that. But learning to shoot in manual does give you more freedom to express yourself through your images, and because you control all the controllable aspects of the visual story. So don't be afraid of the M. The M is your friend. It's easy to get along with, and it's fun. All right, so how can you start going to the next level? So how can you improve more as a photographer? Get a mentor. Work with a professional photographer. Find one who's friendly and nice and will answer your questions. And if they're not friendly and nice and don't answer your questions and are condescending, fire them and hire a different mentor. One of the biggest catalysts to creating Cowgirls with Cameras is that Kara, Phyllis, and I wanted to make more knowledge accessible to people who may have been uncomfortable asking other people about it. So we try to be really open and really honest about this process. And we try to make sure that if you're at one of our workshops or our retreats or working with us as a mentee, that we are very open to your process and where you are in that process. Okay. So find a mentor who will work with you and answer your questions, because it's one of the fastest and easiest ways to learn photography as a skill and also as an art. Also, think about joining us for a workshop, or actually any other photographer that puts them on. It's a great opportunity to meet other photographers and also to be able to really focus in on your photography for a set period of time. I know we have people come to our workshops and our retreats and our experiences that they don't get an opportunity to just be a photographer for 5 days. And at our events, they do. They get to the opportunity to just be a photographer, and they can deep dive into the things that they want to learn or expand on. And our events are designed to meet photographers where they are, from whether they're a beginner into whether they're an advanced professional. It gives you an opportunity to focus in on something that you're wanting to perfect, and the room to make plenty of mistakes in that process without judgment, and also get answers to help you solve the problems. Finally, become a member of our community and other photography communities, because that's another great way to lean in to find mentors and workshop opportunities and more. Reference wise, I do want to point you to a couple of those organizations, ours, of course, at Cowgirls with Cameras, but also Equine Photographers Network. It's run by Corrine Shippers, who is an amazing photographer and a huge advocate for equine photographers. It's a great organization that offers both general and professional level memberships, and it's perfect for networking and connecting with other photographers, as well as brushing up on skills and asking questions that you can't just ask of anybody, because equine photography is a specialization and there are things that are different. Also, the PPA, which is the Professional Photographers of America, they are what I would consider one of the premier photographer organizations in the US. They have great learning resources, fantastic place to up-level your skills as a professional. They offer you multiple paths to prove your photography skills if you don't have a college degree in photography and want to be able to gain some professional credentials. I went through their certified professional photographer evaluation in order to earn that designation, and prove, because I don't have a formal education in photography. I have a lot of self-taught decades of learning this art and science, and they allowed me to demonstrate that and gave me a credential because I did demonstrate it. Great organization. I do want to let you know, if you are an equine photographer, they do lean heavily into the portrait business. So just be aware that not everything is going to apply to you. All right. My name's Kimberly Beer. I did introduce myself in the beginning, but here's a little more about me. I am a podcast host of The Business Animal and a co-host of the Cowgirls with Cameras podcast. Both of those are available multiple episodes per month if you want more of me, and also want more of my business partners, Kara and Phyllis. You can also find me at Be More Business, where that's a good chunk of my life is spent, is helping entrepreneurs create businesses that support the life they want to live. And a lot of times I work with photographers who are like, I have this dream. I want to be able to shoot photos and make a living doing it. And I help people design business models and market their businesses so that they can actually achieve that. You can also find me at Kim Beer Photography. I have a long history as a commercial photographer, working with small businesses and helping them market. I don't do that as much anymore. Most of my days are spent teaching with Cowgirls with Cameras. And so you can catch me at cowgirlswithcameras.com as well. But explore, and if you have questions or would like to talk about mentorships or want to know more about anything I've talked about in this video and the opportunities that are available out there, you can catch me at kim@bemorebusiness.com. Thanks for hanging out with me today. I know it's been a long journey, so if you made it to this point in the video, I want to give you a huge gold star. And I would love to hear from you and your experience about what has this been as a journey for you. And hopefully this video has helped you make some decisions and want to try some things with your photography.